What if I told you? Europe once engineered its own downfall, not with armies but with marriages inside the family. For 3 centuries, thrones guarded pure blood like treasure, and the bill came due in bodies that failed and empires that cracked. If you're into the truths history tried to pretty up, hit subscribe now, because what follows is stranger, darker, and painfully real. This isn't folklore about demons or fairy curses. It's the cold math of heredity colliding with absolute power. When rulers kept wealth by keeping it in-house, rare mutations stopped being rare, and palaces turned into laboratories of unintended consequences. The result wasn't just illness, it was geopolitics in slow motion. A generation born fragile meant treaties signed in fear, wars sparked by empty cradles, and ministers governing around monarchs who could not fully govern themselves. Meet Charles II of Spain, the last frail spark of a line that married itself for centuries. His face became the most famous emblem of the Habsburg jaw, but the deeper story is what that jaw symbolized: a dynasty that tightened its grip until it cut off its own airflow. Charles struggled with the simple act most of us never think about: chewing. His lower jaw projected so far that his teeth barely met. Meals had to be softened into near liquid so he could swallow without danger. It wasn't a private embarrassment. It was a daily reminder in every banquet hall that nature had been overruled too long. Speech came out thick and tangled the tongue, working harder than the words. Envoys leaned toward translators in gilded chambers, trying to decode the intentions of a king whose statements arrived blurred at the edges. In a world where a syllable could shift borders, clarity became a national asset Spain could not always count on. 2 royal weddings promised stability and heirs, but the promise never landed. Court doctors prescribed blessed oils and long prayers. Folk healers muttered remedies. Ceremonies were staged as if ritual alone could reset biology. Each attempt felt like lighting a candle in a wind tunnel. Witnesses described a sweetness and volatility that belonged more to childhood than to a throne. Toys on a council table, sudden laughter in moments meant for gravity decisions swayed by whoever arrived with the most delightful distraction. The myth of invincible monarchy met the reality of human limitation. Illness visited like an uninvited dignitary. Convulsions, infections that lingered public appearances, cut short by indispositions the court could not fully hide. Servants learned the choreography of emergencies. Ministers learned to read the room and finish business before the next wave hit. At 38, Charles died, and the examination that followed painted a muted but unmistakable picture: organs, undersized or compromised, a system worn thin by design rather than chance. His death helped ignite the War of the Spanish Succession, but the fuse had been braided long before, strand by strand, in the marriage contracts of his ancestors. But Charles was only the opening act in this grim symphony of bloodlines. His body may have collapsed under centuries of inbreeding, but the curse of royal genetics did not die with him. It spread across Europe like a hidden contagion, embedded not in armies or treaties, but in chromosomes. Enter Queen Victoria of Britain, remembered by many as the stern grandmother of Europe. Behind the portraits of lace and stoicism, she carried a genetic secret more destructive than any canon hemophilia, a disorder that turned even the smallest wound into a potential death sentence. Victoria herself never bled abnormally. The cruel trick of biology spared her while making her children carriers of a silent time bomb. 9 royal offspring, each one married into a different dynasty, became living vessels of a mutation destined to unravel empires. Her daughter Alice carried the gene into Germany. Another daughter, Beatrice, ferried it to Spain. And still another line reached into Russia, where the consequences would detonate with world-shattering force. What looked like marriage alliances were, in truth, the spread of a lethal inheritance disguised as diplomacy. The public never knew. Royal families choreographed portraits to hide bruises, staged appearances to mask fragility, and issued death notices citing vague fevers. Behind the curtains, however, young princes lived like porcelain dolls wrapped in padding, shielded from games, terrified of the smallest scrape. One of Victoria's own sons, Leopold, embodied the prison of hemophilia. He could not ride a horse, play sports, or even descend stairs without layers of precaution. His life was a study in restraint, a man born to rule, reduced to walking carefully among cushions and whispers. Doctors, baffled by a condition they rarely encountered, prescribed medieval treatments, bloodletting leeches, anything to balance the system. For boys who couldn't clot, these remedies became executions by another name. Every attempt to heal only deepened the injury, and yet hemophilia's cruelty went beyond pain. It was a game of hide-and-seek across generations. Because the gene lurked on the X chromosome, it often skipped a mother and re-emerged in her sons or grandsons. Dynasties lulled themselves into relief, believing the curse gone only to watch it reappear decades later. By the dawn of the 20th century, Victoria's invisible gift had scattered across palaces from London to Madrid, from Berlin to St. Petersburg. Like a medieval plague dressed in velvet, it eroded confidence in monarchies already struggling to appear strong. Genetics, not politics, was weakening crowns from within, and nowhere did this hidden inheritance explode with more violence than in Russia, where a boy named Alexei Romanov would become both the most tragic patient and the most dangerous secret of the empire. In 1904, bells rang across Russia to celebrate the birth of Tsarevich Alexei, long-awaited male heir to the Romanov dynasty. But within months, the jubilation curdled into dread, for the boy carried Queen Victoria's curse in his blood. Hemophilia transformed every bruise into agony, every stumble into a brush with death. Behind palace walls, his bleeding episodes became spectacles of horror. Joints swelled grotesquely, limbs ballooned with trapped blood, and his piercing cries echoed through the gilded chambers. Courtiers whispered prayers, while his parents Nicholas and Alexandra watched in helpless terror as their empire's future writhed in pain. The family's solution was secrecy. Official photographs were staged like theater sets, carefully hiding bruises beneath uniforms or painted backdrops. Public appearances were tightly choreographed guards ready to catch him if he stumbled, doctors hidden in the wings. Russia saw a radiant prince, never the fragile boy behind the curtain. Into this vacuum stepped a figure who seemed torn from folklore, Grigory Rasputin, a wild-eyed mystic from Siberia. To the desperate imperial couple, he appeared as a miracle worker. His presence calmed Alexei. His prayers coincided with moments of recovery, and soon the peasant healer held sway over the world's largest empire. Rasputin's power was not rooted in medicine, but in desperation. Nicholas and Alexandra clung to him like shipwreck survivors to driftwood. A man of visions and vices now whispered in the ears of emperors, steering appointments, influencing policies, and corroding the very legitimacy of the throne. Russian society seethed. Rumors of orgies, corruption, and a holy man manipulating the crown spread like wildfire. The monarchy's silence about Alexei's true condition only deepened suspicion. To the public, it looked as though the royal family was bewitched, enthralled by a sinister monk, while their nation bled in war. By World War I, this secrecy became poison. Soldiers starved at the front cities, rioted, and still the Tsar's decision seemed tethered to the whims of Rasputin. Conspiracies flourished. Was the monarchy cursed? Was the throne itself haunted by weakness hidden from the people? When revolution ignited in 1917, the Romanovs had no shield. Their enemies did not just see a monarchy, they saw a sickly bloodline, an empire ruled by shadows and secrets. Abdication could not save them. To revolutionaries, the royal family was a genetic threat that had to be erased. In July 1918, in a dim basement in Yekaterinburg, Alexei, his parents, and his 4 sisters were executed. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 300 years ended in gunfire and silence brought down not only by politics and war, but by a genetic flaw carried in a single fragile boy. The ultimate irony, modern medicine could have saved him. Today, a simple injection of clotting factors would have spared Alexei his worst torments. But in an age before science could master blood, a hereditary disorder became a state secret, so heavy it helped drag an empire into the grave. But Russia was not the only empire undone by biology. Across the Channel, Britain's King George III carried a different kind of curse, one not of bleeding but of madness. His reign would reveal how a single genetic disorder could ripple outward, reshaping global history in ways no general or diplomat could predict. George's affliction was porphyria, a rare condition that turned his own blood chemistry into a slow-working poison. Attacks struck with a fury, stabbing abdominal pain, muscle weakness, confusion that blurred into hallucination. At his worst, his urine turned a dark, unnatural purple, as if his body was bleeding color itself. These were not private sufferings. They came at the most crucial times in Britain's history. In 1765, as tensions with the American colonies boiled, George was gripped by one of his episodes. Rage and stubbornness replaced reason, compromise evaporated, and negotiations collapsed into defiance. America would soon revolt against a king who could no longer think clearly. His ministers wrote of conversations that spiraled into nonsense of a monarch talking to shadows, railing against phantoms, or flying into uncontrollable rages. To govern a kingdom, clarity was essential, but Britain's crown rested on a mind unraveling in real time. In 1788, the illness peaked. George became detached from reality altogether, babbling about floods in London that never existed, lashing out at his own son, requiring physical restraints to keep him from harming himself or others. The government teetered on collapse, debating whether to declare the king permanently insane. Even during the Napoleonic Wars, French spies whispered of a mad king across the Channel. Napoleon dismissed Britain as a nation crippled by its monarch's condition. At home, Parliament struggled through years of uncertainty, while the empire's subjects wondered whether destiny itself had turned against their ruler. By 1811, George's son was forced to rule as Prince Regent. The old king faded into a twilight of blindness, deafness, and near total madness. He lived in a world populated only by ghosts and memories, an emperor of shadows who had once commanded half the globe. Historians now see the irony. Britain lost its American colonies not only to rebellion, but to the intransigence of a ruler chemically imprisoned by his own bloodline. The revolution, in part, was won by nature itself, dealing a blow no musket or cannon could match. And like the Habsburgs and Romanovs before him, George's fate was no accident. Generations of selective royal marriages had concentrated rare genetic disorders, creating a monarch whose own body betrayed him at the very moment his empire needed him most. The lesson was growing clearer with every dynasty. When power is chained to purity, the crown becomes less a symbol of glory and more a vessel of inherited ruin. Yet perhaps no story illustrates inherited ruin more chillingly than that of Queen Maria Thyrse of Portugal. At her coronation in 1777, she was hailed as Maria the Pious, a capable and devout ruler. But beneath the crown, fragile threads of heredity were already tightening, preparing to snap. By the mid-1780s, the change was undeniable. Court witnesses described screams echoing through the royal palace at night. Maria believed she was damned, convinced demons would drag her soul into eternal fire. Her reign transformed from steady governance into a descent of religious mania and terror. She spent entire days in frantic prayer, refusing food or rest, convinced that any lapse would invite divine punishment. Ministers pleaded for signatures on critical documents, but Maria recoiled, insisting they were tricks sent by the devil. In council chambers, her mutterings and sudden shrieks paralyzed government affairs. The timing was disastrous. Europe convulsed with revolution, and when her nephew Louis XVI of France was executed, Maria collapsed into complete psychological ruin. To her, it wasn't just the fall of a cousin, it was a cosmic warning that every monarch was doomed to follow. Her paranoia infected the court itself. Ambassadors returned home reporting a kingdom ruled by a woman who believed herself already dead. Foreign powers saw weakness. Portugal, once a maritime empire of influence, became an object of pity and derision. The tragedy spread down the line. Maria's son José showed crushing depression. Her grandson Miguel grew infamous for violent moods and erratic cruelty. The Portuguese bloodline had become a chain of unraveling minds, a dynasty collapsing inward with each generation. Historians now trace the source generations of intermarriage, often with Spain's already compromised royal family, created a loop of hereditary fragility. Like the Habsburgs, Portugal had tied its fate to the illusion of pure blood, and the illusion poisoned the mind as surely as it had deformed bodies elsewhere. By 1799, Maria was declared mentally unfit to rule. Her son assumed the regency, but the damage was permanent. The kingdom stumbled through the Napoleonic Wars without strong leadership and eventually lost Brazil, its most valuable colony, forever. The Portuguese case revealed a darker truth than twisted jaws or bleeding princes. Inbreeding didn't just scar flesh. It could dissolve sanity itself, turning palaces into haunted asylums, where rulers prayed, screamed, and withered, while nations fell apart outside their walls. By the dawn of the 19th century, Europe was a patchwork of genetic cautionary tales. The Habsburgs had disfigured themselves, the Romanovs bled out the British crown, stumbled in madness, and Portugal drowned in screams. A pattern had emerged. Obsession with bloodline purity was less a strategy for power than a slow hereditary suicide note written across empires. The 20th century brought a slow and reluctant awakening. Royal families, after centuries of ignoring nature's warnings, could no longer hide the truth behind painted portraits and staged ceremonies. The genetic disasters were too obvious, too costly, and too politically destructive to deny any longer. One by one, monarchs began abandoning the idea of pure blood. Quietly, almost sheepishly, they started marrying outside the narrow circle of cousins and uncles that had defined their alliances for generations. Love matches with nobles of lesser houses, or even commoners, were suddenly recast as acts of wisdom. Science, too, was catching up. The rise of modern genetics in the late 19th and early 20th centuries exposed inbreeding not as superstition, but as measurable biological damage. Terms like hemophilia porphyria and recessive inheritance replaced whispers of curses and demons. Researchers later confirmed what history had shown in agony: the Habsburg jaw hemophilia in Victoria's descendants. The madness of George and Maria, all were predictable outcomes of a gene pool trapped inside castle walls. Bloodlines, meant to preserve power, had in fact engineered fragility, and yet the myth of divine right lingered stubbornly. Monarchs still posed as chosen being symbols above the common lot of humanity, but their bodies told a different story of jaws that could not close veins, that could not clot minds that fractured under invisible pressures. If anything, the shift to marrying outside narrow dynasties came less from enlightenment than survival. After watching empires collapse under the weight of their own biology, Europe's royal families realized that nature had written the rules, and no crown could erase them. The legacy of those genetic disasters lives on in more subtle ways. Modern descendants still carry faint echoes of the old mutations, reminders of how close entire empires came to self-destruction through arrogance disguised as purity. Museums and medical journals preserve the evidence: portraits of kings with distorted jaws, court reports of boys who bled for days, autopsy notes that read like horror stories. These records are not just curiosities, they are warnings etched into history's archives. Because in the end, the true villain was not a single disease, nor one unfortunate monarch. It was the idea itself, the belief that power could be preserved by bottling it in a single family, as if human beings were coins to be hoarded rather than lives to be lived. The lesson still resonates when any society, past or present, confuses purity with strength. It risks the same slow collapse. And history has already shown through kings and queens once thought untouchable that no amount of gold or power can outvote the laws of blood. Centuries later, tourists stroll through the palaces of Madrid, Vienna, Lisbon, and London, admiring chandeliers and frescoes, rarely suspecting the darker stories hidden in those marble halls. Yet every gilded ceiling once echoed with coughs, cries, and the hushed footsteps of servants rushing to manage royal ailments that could not be spoken aloud. The myths endured, of course. Charles II was remembered as the Bewitched, as if sorcery alone explained his suffering. Rasputin was painted as a demonic puppet master, rather than the symptom of a family's desperate secrecy. Madness and weakness were blamed on sins or curses, anything but the true culprit, a bloodline, collapsing under its own arrogance. For centuries, silence was easier than truth. Ministers pretended their monarchs were whole artists, retouched deformities from official portraits. Chroniclers softened words so that future generations would not see how fragile power really was. But silence, like inbreeding compounds over time until collapse, is inevitable. Even in their decline, these dynasties projected grandeur. The Habsburg palaces gleamed, the Romanovs staged magnificent ceremonies, the British Empire expanded under a king losing his mind. To the outside world, the crowns still shone brightly. Inside, however, organs failed, veins burst, and minds slipped into terror. The tragedy is not only biological, but moral. By sacrificing children on the altar of dynastic purity, monarchs revealed how power can blind even the most privileged to basic humanity. Their heirs were not just princes and princesses, they were experiments in hubris bearing the cost of their ancestors' choices. Modern science can map every mutation chart, every inheritance, and explain every symptom. Yet, even stripped of superstition, the horror remains. Europe's most powerful families engineered their own undoing, turning human beings into symbols of decay. And perhaps that is why these stories still captivate us. They are not just grotesque curiosities from the past. They are mirrors reminding us how easily ambition can distort judgment, how quickly the desire for control can spiral into destruction. Because while empires rose and fell with cannons and treaties, some of history's most decisive battles were fought in silence, inside bloodstreams, bones, and brains. The real wars of succession were written not in documents but in DNA, and when those hidden wars were lost, entire nations paid the price. Thrones toppled, colonies were lost, revolutions ignited, and families that once seemed eternal vanished in a single generation. So, the next time you hear tales of kings and queens, remember this. Beneath the jewels and robes, they were prisoners of their own blood. Dynasties that sought immortality instead scripted their own extinction, proving that no crown can shield its wearer from the laws of nature.